Welcome to Impact OC, the only program showcasing the people and organizations shaping Orange County. With your host, Don Camber.
Hello, live from the OC Talk Radio studios at UCI's Beal Applied Innovation Center. I'm OC Talk Radio Public Affairs Director Don Camber with a great guest positively impacting our community. Today I welcome the Saddleback Area Historical Society librarian and historian Margaret Tapper. The Saddleback Area Historical Society was formed in 1973 and became involved in efforts to save historic structures from destruction as the old town of El Toro rapidly disappeared with the subdivision of the area. Thank you, Margaret, for being on Impact OC.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to sharing our story.
Margaret, please continue the story of how your organization was able to save the historic structures from destruction to enable the public to appreciate them.
Well, back in 1973, some of the bankers and some of the real estate agents in the area discovered that the buildings were rapidly disappearing. And one building of particular concern was the old El Toro schoolhouse, which had been vandalized and stripped of some of the wood that was in it, partly because the wood was valuable. It was made of redwood brought down from Northern California. They got together and decided they wanted to save the schoolhouse. So they started an organization in 1973, and by 1974, they were formally recognized as a corporation, a 501c3 corporation. They had a mission, and they started fundraising and working with the county to save the old El Toro schoolhouse from total destruction. Now, the schoolhouse was built in 1891 and was set up as the schoolhouse in El Toro, but it wasn't the first one. And that one, the first schoolhouse in El Toro, was long gone. What the Historical Society also discovered at that point was that other buildings were being threatened to be torn down because they were going to become subdivisions. So they got together, they got the schoolhouse, and the schoolhouse at that time had been St. Anthony's Catholic Church. And when they stopped being, in the 1960s, when they built a bigger church in Laguna Hills, St. Anthony's started leasing it out to people, and it too had been sitting empty and been vandalized. They started raising money. They'd have bake sales and they'd have events to raise money to bring these things together. They started negotiating with the County of Orange because there was a plot of land in what was then El Toro, now called Lake Forest, that had an original Serrano adobe, and the Serrano adobe was one of the 5 buildings built by Jose Antonio Serrano, who was the land grant holder and whose lands covered much of what was El Toro at that time. They were able to negotiate with the county and raise enough money to move the buildings from where they were along El Toro Road to Heritage Hill Historic Park, which is on the corner of Lake Forest and Serrano.
How big are the buildings?
It's a one-room schoolhouse. So the one-room schoolhouse has a main room and 2 side rooms, one of which is a cloakroom for the boys, one of which was a cloakroom for the girls, and then there are 2 small rooms that the teacher used as her office and as a library.
So back then, was it one teacher for all grades, or what grades are we talking about?
We're talking about 1st through 8th grade in one classroom with one teacher. And so when the teacher would teach one group of children, the other groups had assignments, and she'd put the assignments up on the board. And they'd be like spelling, work on your spelling list, work on your math problems, read this story in the, usually McGuffey Reader is what they used. And the children went to school there. If they wanted to go on to high school, they had to go to either Tustin or Santa Ana because there was no high school here in El Toro.
What were the demographics of the families that lived in the area?
They were mostly farming families. They did dryland farming. Some of them raised sheep, but the majority of them were actually dryland farmers, and they would raise beans, wheat, crops that didn't take a lot of water.
What is dry land?
Dryland means that there's no natural water in the area. It doesn't get a lot of rain. There's not a lot of rivers. And so dryland means you plant it and you hope that it rains, because if it doesn't rain, your crops don't grow.
So do the children have to work in the farm?
School was usually scheduled around the farm work. For planting season and harvest season, the children often were not in school. They had to help do things like plant, weed, harvest. If they were lucky, they got to ride a horse to school. If not, they walked.
How many children are we talking about?
There were probably at max maybe 30 children, if that many, usually many fewer, depending on how many families lived in the area.
And were they primarily families who were involved with the farming?
There were all families involved with the farming.
Oh, so that was the school for them.
There was a small store in the town. Their children went to the school. The station, there was a train station. The station master's children, if he had any, or he had any at that point, went to the school. So if you were the butcher, the barber, the postmaster, the store owner, and all the farmers, their children went to that school.
So today, what can people see that's a remnant of what happened back then?
The only thing that they can see is the one-room schoolhouse, which is preserved at Heritage Hill Historic Park. That's it.
So how does your organization educate the public about it?
We work with the park and events. We go to other cities' events and share the story of what it was like to live then. We also have a website, and we also have a Facebook page that we share what we're doing, some of the stories from some of our older members. Our president is 92 years old. He has some great stories. He went to the El Toro schoolhouse.
What does he say about it?
He says that it was very family oriented. He says that, he remembers meeting people like Nellie Gail Moulton, who was part of the community of El Toro. He remembers what it was like to be on a sheep ranch or on a farm. He remembers the harvests, because harvest time was a big deal.
Did they have corporal punishment back then?
Yeah, they did. And some of it was creative. Sometimes if a child misbehaved, the teacher would draw a circle on the board and have the child put their nose in the circle on the board and stand there. Or maybe balance a book on each hand to remind them that they were there to learn not to look out the window or, fidget and hit the kid in front of them.
Why is it important to know about history, and particularly about that area?
I think it's important to know because these are the people of the land we live on. The people of the land have had three waves. The people of the land who were the indigenous people when the European colonists from Spain arrived. The people who were part of the Spanish era, Spanish/Mexican era of this area, and the people who came to settle here from the eastern United States and settled what became the town of El Toro.
So as I should say, more businesses came in the area, did the flavor of the area change?
As the biggest change in the area was the railroad, because it gave them better transportation to places like Santa Ana, which is where they did most of their shopping and commercial work, to Los Angeles and points beyond.
How did they get around during those times?
Horseback, wagon with buggy. Wagon with horses, wagon with buggy. Yeah, that doesn't work. Wagon with horses, or by buggy if they were wealthy enough to have a buggy. But they would ride farm wagons. The kids would sit in the back. Just like in my generation, we rode in the back of pickup trucks, something unheard of today. They rode in the back of a wagon bouncing on a dirt road being pulled by a horse.
What have you learned that you want to share with us about that area?
I think what I've learned is the persistence of people and the stories that they have to tell. We have tapes of some of the pioneers talking about going to school. We have a story from someone named Ray Prothero who lived in the area and went to the one-room schoolhouse. And he tells a story about putting a buggy on the roof of the schoolhouse for a Halloween trick. He and his buddies got together, and somehow there was access. The roof of the schoolhouse has a fence around it. It's like a kind of built along the lines of a New England house where they had the widows, what they called the widow's walk, and they could watch out in the ocean to see if their ship came back. Well, this had a widow's walk, and they got together and somehow disassembled and put a buggy up on the roof of the schoolhouse. That's one of the stories. We have stories from, we have one of the buildings we saved was the Bennett Ranch house. We have Mrs. Bennett talking about living in that house in 1908 and what it was like to live in a house. They didn't have running water in the beginning. They didn't get running water for several years. Talking about how she pumped the water, boiled the water, how she did the laundry, and what it was like to live with her children and her husband on what was at that point a citrus ranch with no running water, but they had this house, and her stories are fascinating.
How many children did families have?
Sometimes 5, 6, 7, even more. Average family size usually was about 5 to 6 children.
And they all were involved with the farming to keep the community running.
They all had assigned chores. One of the Bennett children talks about his assigned chore was to trim some of the brush from one of the plants that was growing alongside the house, and how it had prickly thorns, and they would all hide when it was time to trim those bushes because they didn't want to get the thorn scratches.
Is there any show on today that people could watch that would mimic what happened back then?
To a certain extent, no. You might think something like Little House on the Prairie gives kind of a vision of what it was like to live in a house and scrabble to be a farmer, because being a farmer was hard work and not very profitable and really sometimes discouraging. So the nearest show I could think of is Little House on the Prairie, and that's not really quite like it was here.
So discuss your partnership with the Moulton Museum.
Well, the Moulton Museum has a dedication to preserving the history of the Moulton family and the ranching era, the farming era for this area. And they're intricately tied to El Toro. So we've gone back and forth. They've been a major supporter of the Historical Society for years, and we're their supporters, sharing with them some of our resources. For instance, we have almost complete minutes of the El Toro Women's Club, which was set up in the town of El Toro for the women to get together and do charitable things. They did things like they'd have an Easter egg hunt, or if there was a school program to be put on, they would put the school program on. They'd help put the school program on because it was one teacher. They did things like if someone needed help maybe paying for the groceries that month, they'd have a little fundraiser.
What was the population back then?
You know, very small, probably 100 to 200 people.
So everybody knew everybody.
Everybody knew everybody. Everybody helped everybody. They would have a jar at the general store saying such and such family lost their house in a fire. We're raising money to help them rebuild.
What does El Toro mean?
The bull. And El Toro, there's a story about it. El Toro, they say, is named for the bull. They say that Don Jose Serrano had a bull. The bull fell in a well and was bellowing, and they could hear it all over the ranch. So they named the town El Toro for Don Jose's bull that fell in the well.
Now, you know, when Lake Forest became a city, it was El Toro, or still is El Toro. I understand El Toro were able to keep their zip code.
And the post office name.
Right.
That was a big deal to most of the original residents of El Toro, and what we call the pioneer families, the first East Coast families to come to El Toro. It was a big deal. They fought tooth and nail to keep the name of the town El Toro, but they were outnumbered by newcomers.
So the Historical Society, how many members do you have? What kind of events do you put on?
We have between about 40 to 50 members at the moment. We do 4 events a year. We usually have a speaker. Our next speaker is Chris Epting, who's going to talk about his book of it's called Lost Landmarks in Orange County. In April, we have a tea where we feature one of the pioneer families. In June, we have another event with a speaker. And then in October, we have what we call Pioneer Roundup, where we invite members of the pioneer families to come and share their stories with the new generation of people who live in Lake Forest / El Toro.
So what's that like to have the pioneers interact with newcomers from today?
Some of the people are one of the things is that people are not aware of the stories of the pioneer families, of the Serrano family or the Prothero family or the Osterman family, who are some of the pioneer families in the area. They come and tell the story. At our last tea, we had Jackie Nunez come and talk about the Akashaman Nation and telling the story of the original people of the land that we all live on.
And how did they exist? Because when you live they're like Indians, right?
That the indigenous people had a very thriving lifestyle for more than 10,000 years in this area. They were hunter-gatherers. Their principal diet was what they could hunt and also acorns. And they made like pancakes out of acorn meal. You had to grind it and filter it and get the alkalinity out of it, but you could make like pancakes out of it, and that was their carbohydrate. They also were hunters and fishermen.
So what did they hunt for?
Rabbit, deer. There were bear in the area. I don't know if they hunted bears. The last bear in this area died in the 1930s, but they hunted deer, rabbit, small game.
Was it pretty much women stayed in the home and took care of the home, and then the men went out and worked, or was everybody working?
Everybody had a job. The women took care of the home. The women took care of the kitchen gardens. They also helped on when it was time to harvest or plant. Everybody got together and helped.
So you put on these events, but what's the motivation behind all the members to be part of this organization?
I think the majority of our members want to preserve the stories of the people that went before us, because the stories tie us to those people. And in this day of social isolation, I think it's good to have a story to back you up. We share stories in families. I shared a story in my family about my mom and her siblings who lived in town to go to high school. And my mom's job was to curl her sister's hair. And her sister was giving her grief, so she curled half her hair and sent her off to school. Well, that happened to be the day that her parents came to town and busted her for half curling her sister's hair. Those are the kinds of stories that families tell. We tell the stories of a community, of the people who lived there before us, how they lived, what they did.
Was it a religious community?
Not particularly. I mean, yes, there was a church, and they participated in the church. The church was St. George's Episcopal Mission, and the missionaries, they were missionaries who came from places like Tustin and Santa Ana to have Episcopal services. And the reason it was at St. George's Episcopal Church is because some of the early East Coast settlers were English, or Easterners, and they were Church of England, which is Anglican, which is in this country the Episcopal Church. So they had the church, the Ladies' Aid Society got together principally because of World War I to make bandages and send them off to the front for the soldiers. It evolved into the El Toro Women's Club, and the El Toro Women's Club was basically the social and, I think, community organizers of their day.
So what kinds of things did they put on?
They do things like Easter egg hunts, or if the school had a play, they'd help the teacher do the play. They always had a Christmas program, and they'd give a gift to each child. They had dances. If they needed to raise money, they'd have a dance, and everybody'd contribute food to sell at the dance. Eddie, our president, talks about going to some of those dances at the community hall, which no longer exists, unfortunately. But he talks about going, and the kids would dance and they'd play around. And when it got late and the kids were tired, they'd put the kids to sleep in the car and go on with their dancing and talking.
Is there any areas in Orange County that are similar like that in terms of having great stories about history?
I think every town in every town in Orange County has a story. Anaheim has their stories of the German colony settlers. Tustin has their stories. Santa Ana has the Waffle House. Every town has a story, and I think most towns, mostly in northern Orange County, has a historical society to tell the story of the people who live there.
What got you interested in this organization?
When I was about to become an empty nester, I was interested in history, and I was looking for something to do besides be the parent of teenagers and whatevers. And the docent group at Heritage Hill was looking for docents. And so I signed up. And then I found out there was an historical society, and they had the stories and were dedicated to preserving the stories of the area. And I thought, that's for me. My mom was a history buff, and I think I kind of inherited that from her.
So you basically give docent tours?
The society doesn't. The docent group, there's two groups at Heritage Hill. The Historical Society, which is dedicated to preserving the history, and the docent group, which is dedicated to sharing those stories.
So you're the supporting arm of the
We're kind of
history.
like the backbone.
The backbone. You
Yeah.
raise money so that the docents can go do and educate the public, and you make sure the facilities can operate.
We make sure they have the accurate story. They do their own fundraising. We make sure they have the accurate stories, and if they need support to help share that story, we're there for them.
Can you kind of describe what it was like to live during those times? I know that's got to be difficult because we're in the world of social media.
Well, one of the stories that one of the Bennett boys tells about, and I think this kind of puts it in perspective, especially since this is internet radio, the way they got the news was by newspaper, which came by train. The news of World War I came probably a week later than the war had actually started. When World War II started, they knew instantly because of radio. And so things were much slower. It wasn't instant reaction to whatever was happening that day. You found out about it and you reacted to it, but it could have been a week or 2 weeks later. With the coming of things like radio and later on television and then the internet, it totally changed how they communicated. But these people lived a fairly local life centered on their community rather than on the world, the country or the world around them.
And they put their stories in audio, and do they write them down so that people can read about their stories as well?
Most of the stories that we have are currently audio. We do have some first-person narratives where we asked members of the original families to write out a story about it. The Cook family, for example, if you've heard of Cook's Corner, the Cook family, we have an extensive first-person storytelling of what it was like to grow up on the Cook Ranch back in the day.
Can you share some of that?
They talk about how simple it was, how they focused on going to school, how it was focused on the community, it was focused on the family and the farming actual part of it.
So they were able to relay what happened back then, so when people go to Cook's Corner, they can kind of get a sense of what happened.
Yes, because places like Cook's Corner were originally part of the farming community. That was a place for the sheep herders and the people who lived way out in the canyons to buy groceries. To begin with, when it first started, it wasn't a biker bar back in 1920. That wasn't a biker bar. And when Prohibition ended, then they started having barbecues on the weekend, and they'd serve beer, and it kind of changed. But it was part of the community, and it was a place where people could go grocery shopping, people who lived out in the isolated areas of the canyons.
So when you hear that they might want to develop on some of these areas, what does your organization do?
Well, right, we did what we did back in the 1970s because that's what was happening. The only existing buildings from the town of El Toro still standing are at Heritage Hill Historic Park, St. George's Episcopal Mission, the El Toro Schoolhouse, the Bennett Ranch House, And on that site, originally, one of the Serrano adobes. All the other adobes are gone. All the other buildings in the town are gone. The train depot, the Ulsterman store, the town hall, the community hall. Those have all been torn down and paved over.
What's the website so people can get more information?
The website is sahsoc.org.
Thank you, Saddleback Area Historical Society librarian and historian Margaret Tapper, for being on Impact OC. And I thank everyone for tuning in. I'm OC Talk Radio Public Affairs Director Dawn Camber. Have an impactful day.
You've been listening to Impact OC, the only program showcasing the people and organizations shaping our community. Right here on Orange County's only community radio station, OC Talk Radio.